Thank you, Andrew. Can all hear my voice? So my name is Antti Pentikäinen. It's a Finnish name. I was called in high school in Minnesota Andes, and I didn't know what it meant until afterwards. I'm not picky if you call me Antti or whatever, but I'm a newcomer in DC. I've just accepted a job at George Mason to help to establish a Center for Reconciliation and being a research professor there on the topic. The previous 3 years, I was, well, a little bit on Princeton, writing a book about it, but previous 3 years I was in New York, helping to set up a network of religious and traditional peacemakers, which was a learning community requested by the UN on how do you engage with tribal and religious groups on mediation. And of course, reconciliation was part of the topic there, and it became really evident that this fascinating topic requires further efforts. I don't know any better word, but fell in love with the potential that it has. The challenge, of course, there is that it's a hugely confusing concept. When you look to the United Nations documentation, approximately 75% of the Security Council missions call for reconciliation. So it's an objective given for the UN missions to achieve. And when you study a bit what they tell what should be achieved, there is either none or very different views. When I've spoken to UN special representatives, one of them in Afghanistan says that, well, this is about Taliban dialogue. The special representative in Bosnia says this is a grassroots community's efforts that somehow leads into a reconciled society. So the interpretations are quite wide. My personal calling for this is that it relates to the changing nature of conflicts and the changing patterns of conflicts. I don't know how it is in your schools, but at least when I was in school, we were explained the conflict cycle as escalation, hot conflict, and de-escalation, and somewhere in the end they mentioned reconciliation. I'm not sure if I've seen any of that happening anymore in my years of practice, 20 years of practice. It seems to be a cycle that repeats itself, and what's really scary in that is that the new emergence of violence usually is worse than the previous ones. So for UN promoting the sustaining peace agenda, reconciliation is somehow in the core of it. I've played a role in building NGO brands and so on and so forth, but in this topic, I do feel that's not the right approach. It's no one's right to claim it. Every human being is going through that struggle. Every community is challenged with this issue. There has to be some element of humility in us who are doing that. It's not about us, but there is a role we gotta play. And therefore, I'm coming into this new city with appeal of collaboration. And this is a beautiful invitation, Andrew. Thank you for setting it up so quickly. Thank you for coming. I'm fascinated about your expertise, but also the things we can do together. ESCAR is, of course, known to you, but the decision to set this up is a sign of commitment from their end to play a part in this. My colleague Annalisa will soon share about findings of a workshop that we held at USIP, but I will also be, from now on, year and a half, a visiting scholar at the USIP under Rose's team, which is also a beautiful opportunity to engage with the wider community of practitioners and policymakers. Finally, we also want to bridge the connection of international work and domestic work. You may have noticed that before me, but when I spent some time in Finland, I realized things had changed. There is no more time just to focus overseas. The same challenges are everywhere. And it would be also insulting to say that we would learn from each other. So therefore, we want to discuss also the domestic element of reconciliation. There is a question to you, would we benefit of a community of practitioners that do reconciliation domestically and overseas as one part of the learning community? sharing the mistakes we do, the things we get right, practicing some of the things that might be useful, fascinating, helping each other just to carry the burden of this work. So that's the second part of the panel. With these opening words, I'll hand to Annalisa, who will just briefly summarize the workshop we had. And thank you.
Yes, my name is Annalisa Jackson, and I'm working with the Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation, which is aiming to expand the research and practice around reconciliation, both within ESCAR and also within the wider community here in DC. And I think when we share about our work in reconciliation, oftentimes that's met with a lot of questions, because reconciliation as a concept has so many different implications and can have so many different meanings and definitions. And we could be talking about state-level reconciliation, or reconciliation at a community level, or reconciliation between communities and the state. And on October 4th, we, together with the U.S. Institute for Peace and Inclusive Peace, which is a research institute based in Geneva, came together to organize a one-day workshop where we brought together government leaders and UN agencies and different research institutes, and as well as local reconciliation practitioners, to discuss what is it that we mean by reconciliation, and how can we improve the impact of reconciliation processes. And I think everyone was relieved that the day started with a mapping and an overview of the many different kinds of reconciliation that we could be talking about. And so realizing that there are many different ways that reconciliation has been viewed, many ways that it's been spoken of within the academic community, is helpful as a starting point. And then realizing we might be able to locate ourselves within our different organizations based in different processes or practices that we have been doing. And so with that in mind, then how do we improve the impact of what we're doing? How do we learn from one another? And so that day, I think, was really helpful for practitioners to share with each other the different ways that they had been engaging in reconciliation. I think, speaking to what you said, Antti, we see that here in the U.S. we're living in an increasing times of divisiveness and tension, and we, as Mary Hoke Center, really want to pay attention to that here and look at what we can learn from people who have already been doing that work here in the U.S. already, and see where further support could also be provided. So that's just a little bit more about where we are and where we hope to go. I'll share a little bit more later when we facilitate this conversation about local reconciliation practices, but I'll hand it back over to you, Antti.
Thanks. So I'll go first to Rosario Tucci, who leads the unit that also follows and covers reconciliation. And once you and I, last year October, met, we were very quickly on the same page on the challenges and what to do. But you were given assignment by your president to start to work on this. So could you a little bit share about the rationale why USIP has been doing and is investing on reconciliation, and what's the relevance for the peace building, peace mediation, and sustaining peace more broadly?
Yep, great. I'll also mention that before coming to USIP, I was at USAID, the Agency for International Development, and we had similar challenges at AID. It wasn't clear where reconciliation sat, and it's not to say that it needs to sit somewhere or we need to get in territorial battles, but it was more an indication for me that there wasn't an intentional focus on reconciliation. And you know, we do want different units to be doing reconciliation, as I'll talk about in a minute, but this idea of putting intentional thought and focus on this topic, for the reason that we're going to mention in just a second, it seemed to be absent. USAID has a fund for reconciliation, which is fantastic. It's not to say we don't want resources, but to step back and think about the most effective use of those resources and what are the lessons learned in the field. I don't see that effort has happened, particularly in U.S. government. So when I came to USIP, Antti's exactly right. Our president said we really need to focus more on reconciliation. Again, it's not to say that USIP hasn't been doing strong reconciliation programs over the years, but there was no dedicated effort to step back and think about what are the guidelines, the principles, what are the effective approaches to reconciliation. And there was this growing need to understanding of the importance of reconciliation, especially as you see the sustaining peace effort build, right? So this concept that it's no longer about how do we just end the violence, right? It's just a cessation of violence. Let's just put down our guns and everything will be okay. This recognizing that a lot more needs to happen to prevent the reoccurrence of violence. And that's where reconciliation can play a large role. Because if you think about reconciliation at its core, it's about strengthening relationships between different members of society and between society and the state, right? We're talking a lot about the social contract in the last few years. If you think about strengthening those relationships, and if you think about reconciliation as a dynamic process, not just as something that happens at the end, then you begin to see reconciliation as a significant form of resilience, right? To prevent the reoccurrence of violence, or as a form of prevention, right? To prevent impeding violence. And so that's where I think we're seeing this nexus of reconciliation and the importance that it can play in the sustaining peace agenda. So we have to move away from thinking of reconciliation as something that happens at the end, right? When everything else is done, then we'll begin to talk to each other. That's not how it works, but also we know that willingness declines at the end of the process, resources decline at the end of the process, so it's like this, it's this afterthought right now, as opposed to this effort that can begin at any phase of a conflict. And that's where I think we're trying to think about reconciliation differently, and it was at this workshop that we held that we began to think about how that maybe the approach is about how you locate and contextualize reconciliation, right? So what I mean by that is that there are different reconciliation objectives at different phases of the conflict, and they're happening at different levels with diverse sets of actors, right? And it's about really asking the right questions to find out what's needed at a particular moment in time, right? Throughout this, if you want to call it the peace building process, or what I work more directly on, peace processes, but broadly speaking, the peace process effort. And so if you think about it from that standpoint, some of the lessons that we're learning is that it's important to continually ask what is needed or desired from particular groups, as the objectives will change and evolve over time. I mean, we're talking about building relationships. Of course, the relationship and the dynamics are going to change over time. Yet we're like, these are our objectives, and those are we'll evaluate those objectives in 1 year's time, and then in 3 years' time, and then in 4 years' time. When we talk about flexible adaptive programming, reconciliation, no more program. I've worked in the development space, in the peace building space. Reconciliation needs flexible adaptive programming, not these constant objectives that we'll evaluate in 3 to 5 years. So continually asking what is needed or desired, that's one lesson learned. And again, because of the dynamic and diverse nature of reconciliation, it's critical to seek what reconciliation means to the local actors. So not only, again, what they need in that particular moment, but what does reconciliation mean to them, right? Because we know culturally it can mean very different things. Based on your religious beliefs, it can mean very different things. And so it's really important to ask what that means to the individuals that you're working with. Some groups see it more in the forgiveness lens. There's more of a justice angle to it. So I know that contextualizing, we kind of say this about everything. You need to contextualize it. But in reconciliation, I think it really is critical. And we're looking at ways to do that, and we could talk a little bit more about the Sri Lanka project that we're working with Pamina Furchow in her method of everyday peace indicators. I'm not sure if you've heard about that method, but we're working to actualize that on the ground, and that's a way to source from local actors how they see reconciliation. And again, I could talk about that more later, but the point is that even in a small country like Sri Lanka, what's needed in the north is very different than what's needed in the east and what's needed in the west. They're different communities, they've experienced the conflict different, they're at different stages of reconciliation. So by starting with how do they view it and what do they need, it's a different starting point than USAID prescribing what's needed and then an implementing partner saying, I can do that. You know, we've got local partners, but we can do that. It's a little bit of a different approach or a more nuanced approach. And this method helps to actualize what we all know. We're all saying, we've got to ask the local actors what they want, but this process helps to actually do that. So we can talk more about that. The last thing I would say, and this is what Auntie's really focused on, and what I really enjoy about the approach that we're trying to move forward, is thinking about external assistance in a support capacity, right? And so it's really not about how can we bring reconciliation to the local actors on the ground. I think someone at our workshop said, can you imagine trying to force somebody to reconcile? It doesn't even make sense, right? I mean, that's so crazy. So just like I related a lot to my colleagues' work in nonviolent action and civil resistance. We can't help people, we can't create movements in other countries. We can't create reconciliation in other countries. We really have to be in a support capacity in this particular space that we're working in, or else we will do harm. We can create greater divisions. And so that principle of do no harm is so important in the reconciliation space. So the last thing I'll say, just again from a higher level, and then pass it over to my colleague to talk more deeper, is that reconciliation, we also have to think about it not just as dealing with the past, which is a lot of the work that we've done in the reconciliation space, right? Memorialization and historical documentation, but how do we navigate the tensions between dealing with the past to moving to a shared future, right? And so one of the takeaways from the workshop was asking this question of moving from a divided past to a shared future. And how we make that happen is the work that we'll talk about on the ground. But I only mention that because sometimes when we think about reconciliation, it's a lot about the past, And so we're really more trying to move to the shared future. It also is about navigating tensions between transitional justice and reconciliation. In a lot of people's minds, they're the same thing. I had somebody at USIP ask me that. They said, well, what are we doing on transitional justice? I said, well, I'm not working on transitional justice. I'm working with my colleagues who are working on transitional justice, but reconciliation is a related and complementary space, but it's not transitional justice. And so helping to tease out how those two efforts work together, I think there's a lot more work to be done there. Because there are tensions between the two. Seeking justice and seeking forms of reconciliation can be at odds at times, and we just have to recognize when they're at odds and when there's a sequencing or when they can come together process. And the last thing I'll say is I think we're just scratching the surface on what it means to create significant cultural and attitudinal changes, because when we talk about this as a process, I mean, it's literally a long-term process. If we're talking about changing attitudes, long-standing attitudes, that can't happen over one workshop or one engagement. So how do we not put in place, but how do we look at this as a long-term effort that needs to happen over decades and over generations? And that may require educational reforms and larger efforts than just small projects that we can do. So let me end it there. I've put a lot on the table. I hope I didn't speak too long. But yeah, back to you, Auntie.
Thank you, Ro. And I think what I really enjoyed in working with you is this faith in collaborative efforts. Especially in mediation, we see a lot of turfs, even secrecy, deliberate, keeping information to actors oneself. In reconciliation, that has to be a totally different approach. And so whether it's guided by the missional intent or or procedures, it's really important to enhance this collaborative spirit, and you've really been leading that, so thank you for that. One of the ideas I was trying to contemplate on moving from mediation to reconciliation is because in mediation, principal practice is understanding the insider mediator's effort. So that's where I started to ask the question, then how about in reconciliation? Are there insider reconcilers? And what's the type of work they do, and how does that complement track one activity like commissions, change in the narrative or a historical review? And should it also be combined with more deliberate effort on trauma, addressing trauma? So could these things together actually increase the impact of a process? Of course, I knew that in ESCAR there are incredible scholars that have done work, and I came with the wish to learn from them. And one of them, of course, is with us in the panel. Margarita, I need to apologize. Armenian last words are as difficult as the Finnish. Tadevosyan.
Yes.
Great. She has just completed her PhD. I think you have done your. So, yeah. So she studied what type of spaces NGOs are creating, and also have looked into the insider reconcilers. You were not scared of that concept, and so the question, I would love to hear about your findings, but also what do you think how connecting grassroots efforts to national level could make these processes more effective? And then, of course, having the name of Mary Hoke in our title, we have to understand better the role of women they have played, what they're playing, and how to support them better. So hopefully you can share some findings on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Antti, and thank you, Ro, for setting actually like great background, and a lot of things that I will say will sort of in a way overlap with some themes that Ro has already presented. As Antti said, I consider myself a scholar practitioner. I have been working in the South Caucasus on reconciliation dialogue, facilitating reconciliation dialogues in Georgian Ossetian conflict for 8 years now, but I have been involved also in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Armenian Turkish reconciliation processes as well, to a lesser extent, obviously. And then my practical work kind of triggered an interest in understanding how the insider reconciliation work and what the insider local practitioners do within their societies. That's where the research interest started. And as Rose said, understanding what local mean by reconciliation was an eye-opening experience for me. A lot of times you would see things that they name as reconciliation, as they work with, that you do, that you would not, on an ordinary level, you would not think, oh, this is actually a reconciliation practice. A very telling example for me, for example, was that in case of Armenia, a local organization was doing the monitoring of ceasefire line, and they were also looking into cases of non-combat related deaths in the army to try and diffuse some of the negative perception within the Armenian society of that this is the other side's fault. In their mind, by investigating into this death, they are actually setting a ground within the society to take the blame of the other side and not exacerbate the enemy image and to humanize the other side. So that was a very, that was something that I would never think of myself. They are doing reconciliation, but in their mind, this was a reconciliation practice, which was very fascinating. Going back to your question, Antti, I think the biggest issue that I see is how to strengthen the social contract that Ro mentioned, relationship between state and the civil society, and how to utilize the capacity and the expertise that exists within local practitioners that can feed constructively into the track one process. Unfortunately, there is, again, the example is from the South Caucasus. There is a very strong, within the public, like the society in general, there is a very strong understanding of a weak sense of security. People don't feel secure. And for them, within the traditional understanding of how state works, state is the one who is providing for that security vis-a-vis the enemy. And anything that has to do with reconciliation, the way it is framed, within the society is that we are weakening our position. So we have to trust the state's effort into providing our security. And here where there is a discrepancy between the state and the NGO level, that the fight for influencing the public opinion and power sharing does not really work well. And the civil society or local practitioners are having extremely difficult time to connect with their own state actors and explain, or not even explain, but provide guidance or provide expertise that would help them to have more meaningful or like an overarching reconciliation process that includes also like the official negotiations or the track one process. So I think that's the biggest thing that I would see, and as an outsiders or as a global community that is there to help local practices to develop, is actually helping the local practitioners to connect or provide them tools or capacity to connect with their own government in a non-antagonistic way, because now they're very much are on the opposite sides of the spectrum, and the government usually within the stories that the personal accounts that I've heard, there's a lot of intimidation towards the NGOs that are working in the field of reconciliation, a lot of fabricated cases of treason or like being accused of being CIA spies or working for MI6, like all of those things that are happening that pushes them farther on the margins of the peace process locally. So I think that the key there is how to bridge the gap between reconciliation and security perceptions locally, and also how to facilitate the power sharing between the state and the civil society. And I think as far as it goes for women, South Caucasus, all the societies are very much male-dominated. The politics is very much male-dominated. Interestingly enough, the civil society is majority female-dominated, and there are a lot of female or women practitioners that are engaged in this work, and it makes it even more difficult for them to break through the obstacles that they have. On a positive note, or like on a kind of a brighter end, for example, Georgia in South Caucasus has a slightly different, or is a kind of a beacon of hope, if you will, because they have a lot of, now with a transition, they have much more female representation within the government. Again, it is nominal at this stage, but still they have many female faces. For example, their Minister for Reconciliation and Civic Equality is a woman. Again, her understanding of reconciliation is very different than what we call reconciliation, but still there are much more female faces within the government that help a little bit in terms of empowering women. But I think in a larger context, within the male-dominated societies, creating or paving way for women to be engaged at different levels will make a difference in helping the female or women within the field to be more active. Unfortunately, and not to diminish the role of female groups, but a lot of times, especially in the region, the roles that is acceptable or allowed or publicly acceptable for women is like, oh, this is the union of mothers who lost sons or who lost husbands. They can talk to each other. This is like the niche that is sort of seen as, okay, women can work on those issues, but not provide any more input into any other reconciliation-related practices or processes. So I think there is a need to help them get a wider access to wider spaces, even within the reconciliation field. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita, for these insights and observations, and also congratulations again for your wonderful thesis. To the right of me, there is three great practitioners. So Anni, I'll hand over to you.
So in talking about local practices in reconciliation, we believe that it's really important to learn from people who are doing this work in their own communities. The Mary Hoke Center is interested in advancing research on insider reconcilers, so understanding who are people within their communities who understand their local context, who understand the religious or indigenous tradition that the communities there are coming from, and ways that their communities would find to start navigating the conflicts in between them. So I'm really delighted that we have two incredible women here who have been really active in leading local reconciliation work in the communities that they're from. And I think we'll hear a little bit about the personal nature of reconciliation work, that the reason why we step into this work often stems from deep things within our own stories, and that means that the work can be deeply personal, and it's transformative work. It can be spiritual work, and it can be work that involves healing in a really deep way. And so I think that's an important part of the conversation to highlight and to be aware of. So I'm going to ask Manal Tayyar, who has been in North Carolina just this last year, but she lived in Lebanon and is from there, and has just spent a long time doing incredible work there, leading interfaith reconciliation work between different communities, and has been someone who has inspired me as well in my own journey in this field. But Manal, could you share with us a little bit about what inspired you to do the work that you were doing in Lebanon, and a little bit about what you found to be effective in the work that you were doing between communities? Yeah.
I also just want to mention the reason I'm here is because of my friendship with Annalisa, and I'm just thankful for these things because, friendship has sustained me in very difficult times, and I'm sure you can relate to that. In times of pain, we need people to stand next to us who know us and can call us to the places where we need to be. So in terms of inspiration, I'd like to highlight three things. I grew up in Lebanon, as Annalisa shared, and Lebanon has known many armed conflicts, and I had to move 21 times before I was 18. Many of the times that was because of armed conflict, but also many of the times it was because of my father deciding, now that the armed conflict has separated Christians from Muslims, or certain types of Christians from other kinds of Christians, now that things have kind of settled, okay, we're gonna pack up our stuff and move back into the other area where everyone else is living who is different than us, and we're gonna start a business there, and you're gonna go to their schools, and you're gonna play with our neighbors. And I never really thought of it until recently that this is a form of reconciliation. It's a form of personal commitment to reconciliation. And so I've always said my father has inspired me, but I've now also realized my mother inspires me in the fact that my mother was willing every time to pack up our stuff and say, yes, we will move. That's not easy, 21 times. After 18, I stopped counting because that was me moving. The second thing I want to highlight, and actually the two things that I want to highlight after this are moments of failure in my life. I started working after graduating from university in the area of socioeconomic development, basically helping very poor people start their own jobs. And what I found there was that our hope was to really, through economic development, help the society thrive, and so give security. Security was mentioned as one of, if there's instability, insecurity, there's reason for conflict. And so our thinking behind that was we're gonna try to help people feel more secure. But what we really were doing was we were creating more conflict. We were doing more harm, coming back to the idea of do no harm principle. We were doing more harm than we were doing good. How so? Well, what we were doing was we were providing people who had killed each other, raped each other over 15 years, to come and learn the same skills, photography, chocolate making, accounting, any kinds of skills so that they can open up their own businesses. They would come, learn these things, and then what do they need to do? Go to the community, compete against each other for the same clients. One more reason to have more conflict. Now you're stealing my resources that are very scarce. And so what happened was the municipality where our center was at printed these flyers that said, and they were just thrown in front of our center saying, if this ethnic group does not leave within 48 hours, we will come and kill the men, rape the women, and take the children as hostages. Signed and sealed by my own municipal government. I felt handicapped. I mean, I was already clueless and young, and given a leadership position, I didn't know exactly what I was doing. And then confronted with reality and with the fact that we were creating so much more harm than good, it was just a wake-up call to this, you know, we can't just do good enough work. We need to do excellent work. We need to be very thorough in thinking about our programming. And then the third point, the third moment in my life that really pushed me from there was as I was working in this center. We worked mostly with women and youth. And these two women got into a fight, physical, you know, like throwing chairs at each other kind of fight. And me being the center manager, I was supposed to, you know, walk in with, you know, my demeanor that's very imposing, as you can see. Supposed to do something about the fight. And so I didn't know what to do, but in my family, the way we do things around conflict is you sit down and you tell your story. You tell what happened from your point of view. And I think this is also a point of, you know, reconciliation practices. So we sat down and I asked each woman to tell the story of what happened. And they started accusing each other. It was one Lebanese woman and one Syrian woman. And the Lebanese woman was saying, why do you come after 15 years of your government, you know, what's the word? Abusing, you know, Syria had invaded Lebanon for 15 years. Now you come back as refugees and you want to take our own resources. Why do you want to work here? And I'm saying it with a lot less passion, but there was anger in the tone. And that woman that was sitting there, the Syrian woman, said, you want to hear why I'm here? Let me tell you why I'm here. And she starts with the anger, sharing the story of how her son, her 7-year-old son, got sick. And the only hospital that was the closest hospital to her was from the other political party, the other side of the political scene. And so instead of the doctors helping heal her child, the doctors killed her child, took his organs, sold them, returned his bones in a black bag and said, you can go home now, your child is no longer gonna get sick. She said, if the doctors who pledge, you know, in my own country, how can I trust anyone else in my country? What do you want me to do in my country? And so this opening up, this vulnerability helped, you know, this is our pain that we share with each other and we understand pain. The Lebanese woman and myself were just baffled. We had no words, just, you know, we just wanted to listen. And then the Lebanese woman started sharing her own story. And what I recognized was pain is pain, is pain, is pain. It's across cultures and languages, and we understand what that means. And if we can get to these places of pain, if we can help people share what's happened in their lives, even if our narratives are very different, we can begin to go in the way of reconciliation. Sorry, this was long, but these were the 3 moments in my life. Do you want me to tell about the kinds of things that I've worked on, or
Could you share a little bit more? Thank you for sharing those stories. And I would love to hear if you could share with us some of the things that you've found. You mentioned a little bit about connecting on a level of pain, but is there anything else that you would say you've found to be effective or ways that you would wish for the work that's being done locally to also be further supported? What would you hope to see in some of the work that you were doing?
Thank you. Yeah. So I transitioned from that work to doing reconciliation, interfaith work, after having worked with UN processes around responsibility to protect and early warning and early response mechanisms. I'm going to skip that part because honestly, my heart is in the later part of interfaith work. So I was helping reconcile Muslims and Christians in Lebanon and the Middle East. And what I found to be really important, take notes, food. It's really important. Inviting people to your homes and cooking a home-cooked meal is a lot more effective than going to a workshop where we talk with dry, distance between us. In Lebanese, there's a there's a saying we broke bread and salt together. It basically means we've eaten together, but it really means we've got a friendship that has sustained through ups and downs in life. And so I think it's important to have food at any reconciliation event.
And some bagels and muffins.
Thank you. And to testify, I slept at Annalisa's house yesterday, and having breakfast together with these women, it's just, this is what brings us together. Life. The second element was working with youth, young people. I worked with religious leaders, and they're nice people, but they're also very careful. They walk on eggshells. They don't want to say the wrong thing. And young people are just more free. They will say what they really think, and they will challenge you when they think you're BSing something. They're not afraid to speak their minds. A third thing is faith-based work. So I'm a Christian. All of my life in Lebanon, I tried to hide that identity. The reason being that the Christians and the Muslims killed each other. And if I'm doing peace-building mediation work, reconciliation work, well, I'm involving myself in the conflict. I'm saying I'm part of this group against this group. So all of my life, I was trying to hide that identity until I realized that actually coming to the table with my arms and my cards open, saying, here's my real agenda. I want to follow Christ by loving my neighbor, by loving my enemy, if I believe you to be my enemy. And this is what Christ means to me. And so being completely transparent, I think, is really helpful, because there is no hidden agenda of, yeah, but who are you really funded by? What are you really after? And then the fourth thing is action. Do something, don't only speak. And at every time we came together as Muslims and Christians, we would talk about our faith, but talk about what our faith tells us to do. Christianity and Christ tells us to love our neighbor, to take care of those who are homeless, to feed the hungry, to visit the prisoners. It is action. It's not just beliefs. And so then we asked each other, so what do you believe, the other group? And then we said, okay, well, we have these common beliefs. Let's go and do something about it in community. And so taking it from talking to eating to doing things together creates memories and creates the potential to be able to tell stories later on of, this is what happened in my community. It's not just I went to an event and I came back home. And things that I would like to see strengthened, things that I would like to see supported. Honestly, it's the cross-sectoral work. The older I get, the more I realize that we peace builders have our own language, just like Christians have their Christianese language. We understand each other, right? But if I sit down with a person from the military, do I understand what's their point of view about what security looks like to them? Can we work together? Can I sit down with a business person who's trying to make money, who's trying to, in my world, create security, stability, economic stability, jobs, right? Do we speak each other's languages? And so I really think it's very important to be able to do very cross-sectoral work in order to do meaningful work. The weapons that are provided in Lebanon are produced by the global north. Well, how do they get to the global south? How do we continue to sustain conflict? So I think economics plays a really large role in creating peace and reconciliation. Yes, I'm going to shut up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those insights with us, Manal. And I think a lot of what you shared touched on the holistic nature of this work and how much it involves and touches so many different parts of our own lives and of our whole societies and our whole world. So thank you for sharing many of those stories. Next, we're going to hear from Kujeji Kamara, born and raised in the Bronx, and someone who is leading really incredible work in New York City with the Muslim community there, and has been leading reconciliation workshops and programs at a local level, and also finding ways to connect a deeper and wider understanding of Islam in America with the wider community there in New York. And so, Kujeji, I would love to hear from you a little bit more of your story, maybe what's inspired you to do this work, and similar to what Manal shared, what are some things that you've found to be effective in the work that you're doing? Yeah, maybe we'll start with that.
Good morning, everyone. Kujeji here. I'm sorry if I'm a little stuffy. I'm recovering from a cold, but definitely a pleasure to be here. Really inspired to be among these awesome panelists, and really inspiring to think about how we think about reconciliation. And I remember growing up, when I hear the term reconciliation, I often think of it as an outside process, as something that you have to do in the outer world or with outside communities. But in the work that I've been doing at the Muslim Community Network, I've come to understand that reconciliation is really about an internal process. It's really about me first having to reconcile past histories, past identities, past associations with different groups and with the state, and then using that as a framework and how I engage with other people. And so I identify as a Black Muslim woman, and for me that can be an anomaly, that can be a very challenging experience. Growing up in the United States of America, Malcolm X once said that the most disrespected person in this country is a Black woman, and so I carry that identity as well as being of Muslim identity. When I think about what inspires me to do this work, I think of pain, which is what my colleague Manal mentioned. And for me, a recent pain is when Christchurch massacre happened in New Zealand. And although that was so far away, for me and many people in the Muslim community, it felt very, very close to home. And I would say the reason why, apart from just no one wants to be killed, right? You don't want to have your life taken away from you. For many Muslims, we do Friday prayer, which is like our holy day, every week, and we pray 5 times a day. That is a very crucial part of how we orient ourselves to this world. Is about thinking of God and having God in your mind 5 times a day. And so what was really striking for many Muslims is the victims that were killed at Christchurch, they were performing prayer. They were in the most submissive, they were in communication with God in the most intimate and profound way. And that is when someone decided to take their life. And, you know, for example, when we pray, we say, at the end of our prayer, we say salams, like we greet to our right and we greet to our left. And that is a way of, in these 5 minutes of prayer, I have retained some peace by talking to God, and now I'm going to spread that peace as I finish my prayer and go on to have lunch or back to work. And so that was when these people were killed. And so for many of us, there was something very painful about recognizing that. And in New York City, you know, at Muslim Community Network, we have a lot of really great interfaith relationships with synagogues, with churches, with also Hindu temples, Buddhist temples, with a lot of people who feel convicted by a belief in a higher power of some sort. And so in the aftermath of New Zealand, many people came in Washington Square Park and were like, I just want to be with you. I just want to stand with you. I want to pray with you. I want you to know that our hearts are together and I feel for you very deeply. And so for me and for many people, that was very profound and very moving. And it also brings to me something about bringing communities together to encounter each other and engage with each other shouldn't only happen in moments of crisis, shouldn't only happen in the aftermath of such tragic incidents. It should be a preventative measure. It should be just the way we are and the way we live and love, whether it's food, whether it's engaging in games or just talk, right? This needs to be a preventative thing that is instituted in our societies and how we live. And so in our work at MCN, we are thinking critically about how to kind of make those relationships that we have with our partners in the interfaith world, making them more rooted, so that we're always in relation with each other, we're always in touch with each other, and so we can actually hopefully prevent hate crimes, we can prevent hate. I would also like to touch on sometimes the heavy nature of reconciliation, and when you carry some of the identity that I carry with is heavy. It is constantly maybe a bit overwhelming. And the reason why I say that is I remember in particular a few months ago, there was a friend of a friend who was a recent, she was a victim of a hate crime because of her hijab, the scarf that she wears. She was a West African immigrant young woman going home from work on the bus in New York City in Ramadan, going home in a break fast, and she was attacked by a group of teenagers in the Bronx. They viciously attacked her and then left her there. Her face was really, really beat up, very swollen. And so this is a young woman that has to deal with, you know, being unsafe because she wears a scarf because of her religious identity and also her racial identity, and then also dealing with the fact that she was attacked by young people. These were high school students, they had backpacks. If you look at the video camera and the video footage. And so for me, that was very powerful in realizing that kids are learning hate. They're learning this somewhere, and we have to stop however that hate is being transmitted because it's detrimental to our society. And at least in the Bronx, predominantly people of color, right? So these group of teenagers were also people of color, but they learned this hate about Muslims somewhere and felt, I don't know how they felt on that bus with her, but their only means of interacting with her was to harm and assault her. And then she later had to go and advocate for herself, already as a victim, to pressure NYPD to take on her case as a hate crime because they refused. They didn't think it was supposed to be labeled as a hate crime. And they didn't prosecute the young people who did this to her. And so she had to go to a protest, still badly bruised from the event, and say, like, I deserve to be seen, I deserve to be heard, and that what happened to me is wrong, and that we need to find ways as a society and as a community to come together. And so she has to come again with all of her identities and say, hear me out, listen to me, I'm human, both to NYPD, but also to her perpetrators. And for me, that is very heavy, heavy work. And so sometimes thinking about ways of collective and self-care when we are doing this work. But lastly, I would like to leave you all with an inspirational note. Recently, my organization and partnering with the All Angels Church in New York City and the Rose Council Foundation through Annalisa, we took a group of young Muslim students along with Christian students to Northern England for a 10-day interfaith retreat aiming to bring together Muslim and Christian youth. And that was so beautiful in being able to see high school students engage with each other, encounter each other and their differences, and really be vulnerable with each other. Many of them said that this was the first time I was able to be vulnerable with somebody from another faith, or this is the first time that I was able to sit in a room and talk about my religious identity and not, what's the word? Not feel judged. Particularly many of my Muslim students felt that being in a room with other Christian students actually felt affirming. It didn't diminish their identity as Muslims and their affiliation with their religion. It actually enhanced their relationship with God, being in community and relationship with other people. And so I think sometimes that's maybe what's scary about reconciliation, is that you feel like you're gonna lose something. You're gonna maybe diminish a part of you or who you are. And at least these young people have taught me that, no, I'm actually empowering myself. I'm affirming myself when I encounter other people who are different from me, and I find a way for us to work together.
Thank you so much for sharing. A question to both of you. I'm curious to hear, as leading young women in this space, what have you found have been some of the challenges and maybe some of the opportunities of the work that you're doing as women in this space?
That's a tough one. I confess that we had these questions given to us before. And I had to think about this very hard. It wasn't easy. I think two things come to mind. The first one is that I have very few role model women who are older than me and doing the work that I've been involved in and that I can be inspired by. Sorry, is this too, thank you. Yeah, thank you for giving me a sign. Yeah, so being inspired and having women role models who have done the work before me, and especially single women, I must say. I'm now dating someone, and I'm very happy he's here. But for a long time, I was doing this as a single person. It was very lonely and very scary because, as both of us shared, and I'm sure Annalisa could share the same, and probably many people on the panel, you get to hear very deep and very raw stories, and you have to carry that. And many times you also have to represent yourself. And so it is weighing work. And so having someone who has gone in front of you and done the work and understands what it's like, that for me is very important. And in Lebanon, I didn't have any such person. And it's only recently, this summer, in fact, that I was invited to a global conference where I met people from Georgia, actually, who had done similar work. And she now follows me. We follow up with each other. I consider her to be a mentor and a friend. And so I think women role models who are older than us is something that was challenging for me, given that we didn't have that. And the second thing is that women were often given a lot to do. A lot was put on our plates and expected of us. But then we were always also expected to be in the, not always, often I should say, expected to be in the shadow, in the sense that we do all the administrative work, and we are given maybe an administrative job title. But, publicly, it is a man who takes the role, and sometimes I felt like it was easier for me to do that. I didn't want to be in the public role. And then eventually when I was given the public role, I felt like, really? Like, I don't think I can do this. And so being empowered by men, and I can tell stories, but for the sake of time, I won't right now. Men giving up their seat at the table, men giving up their scholarship, their funding to take a plane and go to a global conference and saying, no, I think you should invite this young woman to do this instead of me. This is the price that is paid to get women to get there. It's saying, not me, them. And the big question for me is, will I and am I doing this with others as well?
Thank you. Khadija, do you have anything to add?
I think Manal covered a lot of it. Just one thing I would like to add for me is there's a lot of power in having women at the table, young women at the table. Also a lot of power in involving young people in the conversation. At least in New York City, speaking personally from the interfaith scene, when I would go to a lot of meetings and programs aimed at bringing together Muslims, Christians, and Jews from the Abrahamic faith, it was always really inspiring to be in the room. But I would always leave the room feeling like there's not enough women here, there's not enough young people here. And so it's great to have a lot of these adults talking about commonalities within our faith and, interesting differences and how we can better serve our communities. But if we're thinking about how to pass this on and teach this on to the next generation, it is very imperative that we have young people in the room, and that we also make sure that when we are at the table, women feel adequately represented and they're able to share their opinions and their ideas, because frankly, maybe I'm biased, but I think women are natural reconcilers. They have to do reconciliation in their families. I'm the oldest of 8 siblings, and so I've had to do this growing up. There was no manual, there was no training. It's just how I had to make sure my family functioned. And so kind of empowering also those women who are doing it in their community, they're doing it in their mosque, they're doing it in their families, and bringing them to the table when we were talking about how can we better peace processes.
Thank you so much. Ante, should we give time now for a few questions for our panel, and then we can have our
Hopefully
closing
many,
discussion?
but
Yes.
we have to close Andrew 12 before 11. So let's take a round before we come back to the panel. Let's take a round of questions. So yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Damian, and I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Western Balkans. Thank you for organizing this event. I would have a question related to peace building or reconciliation process when you have the cases where the system or the country is like fostering divisions through the education, through the system itself. How to create sustainable solution, how to make reconciliation? Is it possible with small-scale projects not supported by different donors or internally? When you have you have system you are fighting against, like you can reach out to a number of people, but the system is like feeding all the population that is going through that system. How to work in these conditions? As Madam from the Peace Institute mentioned, flexibility and adaptability is important. I would also add the word systematic approach towards finding like root causes of solution. Because otherwise, even if you change small level projects, you adapt them to specific circumstances, unless you address the root causes, which is like cultural and structural violence, it's really hard to get to the sustainable solution.
Chip.
Let me follow up on Damian's question. It's something I'm interested in general, but haven't thought about in reconciliation. So, yes, we have to address the structural issues. But in the work that I've thought about, you concentrate first on the things that are working. So the logic, as I've heard you talk about it, of insider reconciliation, how do you start with the things that are working in a community? And then the hard part is then how do you build out to the kinds of things he was talking about? And if you can answer that, any of you, I'll give you the Nobel Prize.
Welcome. And then- Great.
I'm Bobby Gotcha from Seas of Peace, and we're always faced with a problem of timing. People usually tell us, well, it's not the time.
Yep.
You have to wait. And our position has been that no, now's the time. Always now's the time. But if that's your experience, I'd be interested.
Thank you. All right, Manal, if that's your boyfriend, I understand you're going to have really good discussions. So, if I count right, there's 2 minutes per panelist and 1 for me and Anni close to be in time. Margarita, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm gonna, thank you for the questions, and these are some big and challenging questions, and I'll try to hit some points for every of them. So when you talk about defensiveness, how to break that down, I think in Armenia, at least, we had a very telling case. In 2016, there was a violent escalation on the contact line, which was called the 4-day war, and this is where a lot of NGOs or people who were working on peace building started struggling. Now there is a popular sentiment against, like, we're at war, and how to do peace building, how to break that defensiveness. And I think the answer is the persistence. Even at the times of at times of war, if the reconciliation process has to be persistent and follow on, because it is easy to be a peace builder in times of peace. It is very difficult to be a peace builder when there is an active war going on. In terms of the fostering or confronting the systemic challenges, I totally agree. In the South Caucasus, there is a wide militarization of public discourse through education system right now, and I think one of the work that is going on that I'm putting a lot of faith in is the process of creating or like working with teachers at schools and especially history education teachers to try and provide or like kind of insert a little bit of alternative narrative, because again, militarization of the education system is fraught with very devastating consequences. Then to the CHIPS question in terms of how to focus on things that are working, I would in this case point fingers at the outsiders and donors. My experience is in this case, and this was a complaint a lot that I've heard from the local practitioners, donors constantly look for like new things. We have tried this, like this, tendency of running through the for the fad like a fashion is devastating for the peace building community. Oh yeah, you have been doing this thing, even though it works, you have been doing this thing for 6 years. We want to see something new, and that something new actually a lot of times undermines a good effort that has been there for 7 or 8 years. I think that's a challenge. And then for the academic and grassroots question, in my practice, I find the application of action research methodology, where you actually work with you'll work with your local communities, not as they are your implementing partners, but the co-creators of the knowledge and co-creators of the practices. Very rewarding and helpful, especially when you're trying to both kind of not educate them, but pass down the knowledge, but also get empowered and learn from them in a way that makes sense for both of the parties. Thank you, and I'm just gonna shut up.
Right down the line. Okay, I'll try and be quick. Hello? Okay, so those were all exactly the questions that we're tackling, we're working to tackle. On the first question of defensiveness or empathy and openness, I mean, I think that's the whole space of recognizing biases and starting from what our own biases are, right? So taking a pause and thinking about how am I being biased towards whatever group I'm in. So there's a lot of interesting work being done around neuroscience and social psychology, and so we're looking at that nexus as we speak, and we just have to continue bringing those pieces together. On the second question, I mean, if we're off the record, Bosnia kind of is the case study of a peace process that kind of like froze everything in time, froze the separation in time, and didn't have the reconciliation components to it, similar to Northern Ireland. And that's I mean, unfortunately, those are the cases we go to say, when you don't do reconciliation, this is what happens 20 years later, you know? You live 25, so in Belfast, it's different. But yeah, that's what happens. You just freeze that separation in time, and when something like Brexit happens, or tensions rise again, because they eventually will, right? Is the society resilient, or will it break along those divisions, or will those divisions be fueled? So the response that we have to try and get at those institutional changes is it's kind of I don't know if it's everybody's agenda, but it's my agenda in the inclusion space and peace processes is, how do I break this system? How do I break this elite deal up? What I mean by that is, how do I bring more civil society or public perspectives into the conversation? How do I make this essentially a more democratic process where people's grievances, the root causes of the conflict, begin to come out? And so that the pact is not just between the government and the one warring party, which only represents a handful of people. So that's kind of my way of getting at it. And if you broaden that participation in the peace process, you begin to tackle some of the institutional challenges that there are. And the peace process is a great window from which to try to restructure some of those systemic challenges. But you have to think of the peace process in that way, and not as, how do we just, get two parties to sign an agreement and put their guns away. Now's not the time. I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to say. As a process, it always exists. There's never one moment. It's just a matter of figuring out what objectives you can achieve at that particular moment in time. And this is the narrative that we just have to change in the reconciliation space. We just have to help people realize this as preventative, as sustaining peace, as a critical component of it, not a side component or an aftermath. But that's just going to take time. It's going to take hundreds and hundreds of these continuous conversations in Washington and New York and elsewhere to just change the narrative. And lastly, when the national government can be the perpetrator or at the national level, I mean, we're looking at some interesting research on resistance to inclusion, which is kind of a little bit there's parallels here. And what I mean to say is when the national government is kind of manipulating the system for their own purposes, that's a form of resistance. And you can navigate that resistance. And there are tactics that you can use to navigate it, because essentially what's happening are tactics like false compliance. Like, they're pretending to be inclusive, or they're pretending to be a bridge maker when they're actually not. And so unpacking what that resistance looks like and navigating it is kind of the strategy that we're starting to apply to get at this. Sorry, that's a lot.
I don't think I'll be able to answer all the questions, but I'll focus on one, and that relates to thinking more critically about like empathy and how to maybe make that process easier or institute it, primarily from my context when working with young people. I immediately think of a young Muslim Bangladeshi boy that I work with. And when he was getting ready to go on our trip to the UK, he expressed how he was hesitant about interfaith dialogue. He didn't want to betray who he was as a Muslim and his own religious beliefs by talking about and interacting with another faith. But actually, at the end of the trip, what he learned was in engaging with other people who are different from you through storytelling and through really being vulnerable and practicing empathy with each other, that you actually are not betraying your identity and your beliefs. You're, like I said before, empowering them. And so when we were on the retreat with the high school students, some of the exercises that they found to be really powerful was something called the 3 chairs exercise, where they had to think of a conflict or an issue that is personal for them, And whether it's a fight with your sister, for example, think of it from your perspective, think about it from your sister's perspective, and then also think about it from God's perspective. And so when the kids had to do the 3 chairs and like sit in each chair and think about what does this other person feel, like whether it's body language, what are they saying, and then also in God's point of view, what is he seeing from both of the stories? It was really, really transformational. And a lot of the kids were thinking about personal things that they've gone through with family, friends, and how this exercise really helped them think of maybe how in hindsight they could have solved some of those issues. And also something that was really, that the students found really interesting was engaging in text study with other students. So, you know, being able to read a verse or a chapter from the Bible and also reading a verse from the Quran through scriptural reasoning allowed you, so some of the Muslim students I worked with initially expressed that they felt a little apprehensive and a little tense when the Quranic passage was being read, because that's home, like that's who they were. And so you have somebody else coming in and taking space in your home, and you might be a little bit defensive and a little maybe apprehensive, but in that exercise, they had to let their guard down, make the home inviting, maybe explain something. This is why we hang this on the wall, and these are why the chairs are this color, in terms of the Quran, and laying it out, and actually found that in connecting through text study, they found really interesting things about commonalities that both of the faiths share, and also intriguing differences. But it was a practice of being vulnerable, which I think is really powerful.
Andrew, do we have a minute or 5?
Okay.
Okay, so it's going to be,
I'm gonna skip.
okay.
Yeah. Great questions.
So maybe some discussions on the hallway on the 20 seconds.
We spoke about the challenge of, to speak to your question, the way that reconciliation is discussed in the academic and NGO community versus the intuitive wisdom that comes from local communities as a really important part of what we are looking at, and looking at how do we perhaps create guidelines around how we use even the term reconciliation when we're naming programs and going into communities. We need to be really careful about when we're using that word and being mindful of the implications that it will have. Not to say that it can't be in the intention, but I think it's really critical that we're asking ourselves those questions of, is this term and terminology going to be helpful, and how can we also elicit or understand the wisdom from the local practices and what's happening. And that's really important for us as the Mary Hoke Center too, to be advancing the research around understanding the ways in which local inside reconcilers are doing that work. So.
Chip, just a comment. I think who deserve the Nobel Peace Prizes are the local practitioners, and what we have to do is that we don't fail them. The cycle of conflict is getting so hard, and the amount of violence and hate that's out there, that even when the drivers one day for the continuation of the conflict may be over, we will fail these communities if we don't understand better how to support reconciliation. And what really haunts me, you pointed out this question of timing. There are certain moments of opportunity that are short, and those moments will come, but now we have the time to do research and create those collaborative structures to respond in a better way than we have as a community. Thank you all for coming. I wish we can be part of your community of working together.